I did not know Zoom did that. All right, so
That's new.
I'm not using my MacBook, so I'm like, oh no, what's happening? Can't go any worse than when my computer actually froze during last Wednesday's program. So, all right, so we are going to get started with queer cinema, and I'm going to minimize this. Okay, so Todd, if anyone else comes in, let them in, and Jamie, I will just, feel free to jump in, or if I have a specific question, I will ask you. So this is Queer Cinema, hosted by me, Liz, and Jamie McConaughey. No relation to Matthew, as far as you know.
Don't say that on recording. I'm planning on talented Mr. Ripleying him.
Darn it. Okay, sorry about that. Everyone just forget you heard that. All right, so we're going to start with the definition. What is queer cinema? So depending on how old you are, queer might not be a term that is good. I actually remember being a teenager, queer was more of a pejorative rather than what it's kind of become now, which is kind of a catch-all umbrella term for the LGBTQ community. So the term new queer cinema was coined in 1992 by film writer B. Ruby Rich to describe a new crop of queer films and queer creators that were making fairly, I wouldn't say confrontational, but fairly groundbreaking content. In the book, which we do have here at the library, Queer Images, the authors, Benshoff and Griffin, they discuss multiple ways to answer like, what is a queer film? And there's really not one answer. They look at it instead from a number of angles. So either the characters are queer or queer coded, and put a pin in that, we'll get to that. The authorship, was it written, directed, or produced by a queer creator? Spectatorship, if it's watched by or aimed at a queer audience. So a film like Rocky Horror Picture Show in the 70s definitely found a queer audience. The genre, is it a musical? Is it sci-fi? And those are genres that, for whatever reason, queer people tend to gravitate towards. Or the experience. Who is the movie asking you to empathize with? So an example of that might be, let's say the film, just off the top of my head, Boys Don't Cry. It is asking you to empathize with Brandon Teena, a trans man who's trying to live his life, rather than empathize with the people who killed him. And even in the book Queer Images, the authors kind of say, like, there is no one catch-all. A movie can have queer characters, but also be fairly homophobic or cruel towards those characters. Or the film can be written by queer people and not necessarily embraced by the queer community. As Jamie, you mentioned Ryan Murphy is one where you're like, he's gay, but I don't feel really represented by a lot of his work.
Definitely.
Yeah, and so I kind of tried to say, like, a good way to encapsulate this is films that deal with queer themes or are by queer filmmakers. It's just a good way to start. So I did say put a note in queer coded. This is something is going to come up during the program. And what does that mean? So there's a quote by Trisha Ennis, and it says, queer coding, much as the name suggests, refers to a process by which characters in a piece of fictional media seem or code queer. So this is usually determined by a series of characteristics that are traditionally associated with queerness, such as effeminate presentations by male characters or more masculine ones from female characters. These characters seem somehow less than straight, so we associate these characters with queerness, even if their sexual orientation is never part of the story. So some examples. I would say almost everyone in Interview with the Vampire, any Disney villain from The Little Mermaid onward. Actually, fun fact about The Little Mermaid, Ursula's design was inspired by the drag performer Divine. I am not kidding. Look it up. Norman Bates in Psycho is an incredibly queer-coded character. There's Plato in Rebel Without a Cause, which that's almost pushing it. Like, some people will argue he is as explicitly queer as you can get in a film in the 1950s. And some other examples from media, Xena, it's not television, but, or it's not film, but come on. Peppermint Patty and Peanuts, there's always been the joke about her and Marcy. And unfortunately, Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs. That's something we'll discuss when we get into the 90s. Kind of that and the Norman Bates thing.
What's interesting about the Disney villains being so extremely queer coded from About the Little Mermaid on is as the remakes start to reach that point. I'm sure we've all noticed that Disney has had a spate of live action remakes, and as they get to the point where they're remaking those movies, they seem to be trying to pull the queer coding out of them. I remember watching the new Lion King movie, and they added this, and the Scar is pretty queer coded in the original. Like he's kind of effeminate. He has a lot of sort of queer characteristics that you can have with a lion, but they add this very strange subplot in the live action remake where he's kind of in love with Simba's mother, and I don't recall if it actually goes anywhere. I got very bored by that movie, but it's real. I'm really going to be interested to see what they do with Ursula come that movie's remake.
Well, which is interesting because the live action Beauty and the Beast, they tried to, I'm blanking on his name, LeFou. They turned up the queerness in that, but maybe because it wasn't well received, or as we'll get to later in the program, because they need money in countries like China. I think that's really what's leading more to toning it down.
Mm-hmm.
When in doubt, look at money. So we're going to go into like very early cinema. Much as with when I talked about Black directors and women in film, even women in color in film, it's not new. It has always been there in queerness or allusions to. They're in early cinema as well. The earliest one that a lot of people point to is called The Gay Brothers. And while it is not explicitly homosexual, the fact that it features same-sex intimacy, which at the time, intimacy between men or physical intimacy, such as hugging, holding, dancing around together, that was not as stigmatized. It has kind of found an audience. There are, queer people look at it as like, okay, I do see myself in this. One of the more interesting examples I read about in Queer Images, and I was able to find some footage of it, was A Florida Enchantment. So that is from 1914. It's a silent film. A woman takes a magic pill. She starts growing facial hair, takes a male name, starts wearing a suit. This is, a lot of people always go, well, this definitely reminds me of hormone therapy. And it is played for laughs, especially in the second half of the film, where the husband decides to take a pill, dons a dress, and then is chased by an angry mob, which, unfortunately times have not changed that much. But it's one where you look at it and you're like, it's the idea of cross-dressing, the idea of gender bending. It's not as new as we think. And actually, I do want to reference India Moore. She is on the show Pose. They asked her at a red carpet premiere about like, oh, what do you think of all of a sudden there's being so much visibility for trans people? And they replied, we've been here. We have always been here. If you look at indigenous cultures all around the globe, they all knew that there was there wasn't just a binary. There was a little bit more wiggle room for everybody. And that applies to humans and that applies to cinema as well. I want to point out these two films, different from the others, The German and Mikkel. So these were, if we know anything about Germany and the Holocaust, queer people did not fare very well in that. They were also put into camps. The image of the pink triangle is iconic for a number of, for that reason. And it's been in some cases reclaimed by activist groups. Others are kind of like, don't use it at all. That's, I think, a whole other discussion. But Germany in like the, post-war, the Weimar era, before the Nazis, there was an institute there called, I believe, there are a number of different names. I believe the best name for it in English would be the Institute of Sex Research. And there were doctors and psychologists who were documenting people who were gay, people who were lesbian, bisexual, people who were trans, people who cross-dressed. So there was a lot of awareness about that in Germany in the 1920s. And so that film Mikhail is a movie that makes an explicit call for gay rights and for gay people to be seen as people. And if you've ever seen the images of Nazis burning books, in quite a few of those images, the research work from that institute is what they were burning.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to say that one of the things that I think that we see in a lot of people's minds in terms of not just queer representation and queer rights, but also like any minority group rights, is that we think that it's just this like direct path upwards and that it all follows the same path. And that's very much not the case. A lot of times there is a gain of rights and then a major backlash from the people in power, and then it goes up and down. And so Liz is correct, in the early years of cinema, there was a lot more queerness than I think, even in American cinema, but especially in European cinema, I think people are aware of. And a lot of these films are completely lost, unfortunately.
Well, in Hollywood in like the 20s and early 30s was interesting. So you had Patsy Kelly, if you're a fan of Rosemary's Baby, Laura Louise, was an out lesbian who spoke about being lesbian. Director Dorothy Arzner was not. There's conflicting reports as to how out she was. I think it would probably be an open secret. George Cukor, who's nominated for an Academy Award in the 30s, that was kind of an, people knew, they just didn't talk about it. Marlene Dietrich was a big star.
Truman Capote.
Yep, Truman Capote. So there were people who were out or out-ish who were allowed to have big careers, but if you've been following my program since my last year, when I talked about film censorship, I talked about the Hays Code, and one of the big things in the Hays Code was you could not show same-sex attraction. The only time you would see it is now in stuff like the exploitation films like Children of Loneliness. So I do want to move on to like 50s and 60s. So in the 50s, the Hays Code starts to loosen up a little. It had been gradually losing power like throughout the 50s. But with exploitation, it was kind of the few areas you could explore queerness a bit. And I think the best example of that is Ed Wood's Glen or Glenda. So I don't know, is transvestitism an outdated term? Because that's the term used in Glen or Glenda, but.
Yes and no. Like I think it's still a term that people, I will say that a lot of queer terms, the answer is going to be no with an if, yes with a but. Because like we're using queer cinema here, but there are people who will say that since queer is what amounts to a reclaimed slur, it's not a word we should be using. So I don't know if transvestitism is still a in vogue word. If I had to guess, I would say no.
Okay. Yeah, but Glen or Glenda deals with someone who, a man who starts to cross-dress, remakes themselves as a woman. It is heavily considered to be inspired by Christine Jorgensen, who became a minor celebrity in the 50s. She was the Army GI who transitioned and, lived a happy life after she transitioned, despite having both, supportive fame and ridicule. You had stuff like Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which, Tennessee Williams and queer content, that's something that's going to exist. But for films, it would have been removed. Or you had films like Tea and Sympathy, which acknowledges homosexuality, but the character's not gay. It's like, oh no, I've been falsely accused. Or The Children's Hour, which that's an interesting one because you could consider it to be a sympathetic portrayal of a woman who has feelings for another woman. But at the end of the film, she ends up being not able to handle it. And content warning here if you don't want to hear about suicide, but takes her own life. And that's I put there the bury your gays trope, which is something that was found, you can find a lot throughout fiction, just like a gay character exists, but then they die. Once we get into the 60s, in more experimental cinema, we get Andy Warhol, we get stuff like Kiss, Biker Boy, great Italian directors like Pasolini. He makes his debut. Pasolini, not all of his films I would say are explicitly queer, but he was someone who wore his identity on his sleeve. The most interesting movie I would say out of all of this is 69's Midnight Cowboy. There is that blurring of the line. Are these guys just very good friends? Is this a close friendship, or is there something more? And kind of almost this fear between the two of them that it might be something more. And the man who directed it was out at the time. I just want to note, Queer Images called it a meditation on the borders between homosociality and homosexuality. And I did include the direction of homosociality, which is sociological term that pertains to same-sex relationships that are not romantic, such as close friendships. So I would like to highlight 3 movies from the 50s and 60s that really stand out and are still, I think, really either stand out or are really well loved and or really considered to be like hard parts of the queer cinema canon. And the first is one of the best comedies of all time, and one that I think has aged better than more recent comedies, which is Billy Wilder's hysterical Some Like It Hot. If you've never seen this movie, which you should, two men, one's a saxophone player, one's a bass player. They need to get out of town after witnessing a crime. And they're like, okay, there's a great gig in Florida. It's paid. Oh no, it's a ladies band. At first they're like, I guess we can't get it. And then they're like, we absolutely need to get out of town. And this is how we're getting out of town. So it's Jack Lemmon and Tony Curtis. This was actually produced without the approval of the Hays Code. And sorry, I lost my train of thought for a minute. What's interesting, obviously, because it plays with cross-dressing, there are jokes about homosexuality. There's Jack Lemmon's character, when he's in drag, catches the eye of this old millionaire. And Jack Lemmon's character is like, maybe I could just marry this guy and get a quickie divorce. And Tony Curtis's character is like, why would a guy marry another guy? Jack Lemmon's character just replies, security. Like it takes these, what could have been, I think, a lot more mean-spirited jokes and turns them into something more, it elevates it. And the final line of the movie is one of the most famous, where Jack Lemmon's character is trying to tell the millionaire, like, I can't marry you. I smoke. I have a bad past. And he's like, oh no, it's fine. It's fine. Jack Lemmon just rips off his wig and admits, I'm a man. And Osgood, the millionaire, just says, well, nobody's perfect, and the film ends. And that is almost revolutionary in a strange way, especially for 1959. And especially considering, like, as far as the 90s and the early aughts, the idea of the reveal that a beautiful woman is a man is met with, like, I think Ace Ventura is a very good example of anger, disgust, puking. Sting in 1959, a guy just go, all right, no one's perfect. I think that's one of the, many, many, many reasons this movie has endured. It basically plays with gender in a very smart way, and in a way that, again, I don't even think more recent films have done. They're moving on to what is considered by many to be the first real entry of queer cinema, or at least modern queer cinema. So Scorpio Rising is a short film directed by Kenneth Anger. Completed in 1963, made the rounds on the more experimental circuit. It is, Jamie, how much do you know about Kenneth Anger?
A bit.
Yeah, what's the best, most library-friendly way to put this? I might put it as Kenneth Anger is an interesting guy, and his movies are not for everyone.
I would, so there's a subgenre of movies that, for whatever reason, someone will ask me, I guess the best known example would probably be Gaspar Noé.
Yes.
Someone will ask me, like, did you like Into the Void? Oh, not really. Should you see it? Oh, definitely.
Okay.
That's how I put Kenneth Anger. You're probably not going to have a good time, but it's worth doing anyway.
Okay. Yeah, so it is a provocative film, to say the least. Sex, drugs, Nazi imagery, occult imagery, homoeroticism, a whole lot of leather, and from an explicitly queer filmmaker. But he did inspire a lot of other directors. If you're a fan of Drive, Kenneth Anger in this film specifically is a huge inspiration to Nicholas Winding Refn. I can never say his last name. Refn? Jesk? Got do a little what we do in the shadows shout out. The third film I would like to highlight. So this is a movie before Paris is Burning, before La Cage aux Folles, before RuPaul and RuPaul's Drag Race. We had The Queen. And this is I would consider probably the first time, not drag as in female personatorship on the big screen because we had stuff like Victor and Victoria, but drag is in drag queens, drag is in the art of drag that we recognize now. So this was released in 1968, and this is about a drag beauty contest, pretty much, yeah, drag beauty contest. If it's known for anything, it's probably Crystal LaBeijah's reaction to Harlow's win. And I would say one of the best insults in the world, which is I declare that she's one of the uglier people in the world. I love just finding an opportunity to use that. But for, drag is still, I think for a lot of people, still very new, but this is a good example of it has been a part of our culture for a really long time. And it was definitely more niche then. I would think probably a lot of people who went to go see it, they were either people who were in the know in cities, or it was a little bit more voyeuristic. But the film actually, similar to later films like Paris is Burning, does try to get into who the people behind the makeup are. They talk about gender, they talk about race, they talk about if they want to get sex reassignment surgery. Some of the language is definitely a little outdated, but it is still, I think, a really interesting relic. And it was lost, I think, for a while. If of all people, I think there are streaming services, Netflix had it available, and that's how it had somewhat of a resurgence. That and the fact that RuPaul's Drag Race, whatever you think of the show or of RuPaul, has brought some more obscure parts of drag culture to a wider audience. And I think, what was it, Aja doing Crystal LaBeijah for Snatch Game introduced a whole new generation of people to this, go, oh, I should go watch this. But again, I look at it, 1968, it seems like, especially like, oh, we hadn't had the 70s yet. This is a year before Stonewall. It feels like, oh, wow, I didn't even conceive a few years ago that in 1968, a somewhat major documentary about drag queens could have been released. Like, Jamie, I assume we are going to have some more talks about RuPaul as we get into the 90s.
I'm gonna go ahead and say that I am going to avoid discussions of RuPaul.
Okay,
all right. You want to talk about RuPaul, you can, but I feel like I'm not real. I'm gonna go ahead and say that despite the fact that I think this is something that I think is worth commenting on, that despite the fact that I've been openly bisexual since I was 14, I have never felt especially comfortable in gay male spaces, which is one of those things that makes it go like, wow, I was really obvious. So I never really got into RuPaul's Drag Race, so I don't know much about it.
Yeah, I mean, I just love big wigs and glittery makeup, so I was just gravitated towards it.
That's fair.
All right, so we're moving on to the 70s. So 70s, Stonewall had happened in 1969. And they're also like, the 70s was, if you know anything about the history of America, 60s and 70s, a lot of time of upheaval. The 70s kind of, with Stonewall, really started the larger national push for gay rights and gay visibility. And we had Harvey Milk, the first, I think, openly gay politician, elected in San Francisco and then assassinated in the end of the decade. He was one of his big pushes for a lot, because he was very active in the gay community, was number one, trying to kind of say, okay, if you're going to support these causes, you are not going to get our business anymore, trying to pull kind of the economic end of that. But he also encouraged a lot of gay people, a lot of queer people to come out to their families, because in the 70s, you had people like Anita Bryant pulling the whole think of the children thing. And this is where we saw not quite a resurgence, because the idea of gay people trying to prey on your kids has always been a very nasty stereotype that I've seen in homophobia, but she really helped drum that up again. And across the country, there were a lot of ordinances where it was like a person could be fired for being gay, or even barred from, let's say, teaching if they were gay. And oh, go on. Yep.
I just wanted to say that one of the core ideas of that, and I do like, one of the things that I think that a mistake that people make when they think about anti-gay backlashes in politics. They think that, oh, this is a genuine, this is sincere, this is a grassroots thing, when in fact they are very often intentional and targeted. There's this really great interview with a gay sci-fi author named Samuel R. Delaney, where he talks about how he was gay in the 50s, and he was sitting on top of a hill near a hookup zone at a truck stop. And when some police came to raid it, like something like 100 men ran out of the bushes. And there was no way the police could notice there was 100 dudes running out of between these stops. But then the paper only reported that like 2 or 3 people were there. And he commented that part of the intention of that is to make sure that gay people, feel like they are alone and they can't talk with anyone about it. So these things aren't like done. Anita Bryant wasn't doing this haphazardly. She had intent and purpose.
Yeah.
Sorry, I really interrupted there.
Oh no, it's okay. But actually, like, sort of going on that, the idea, especially bringing the idea of like kids into it, that's a very targeted thing too, because that's immediately going to put people's defenses up. And that's something that we've seen. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s had that as well. If you're familiar with stuff like the McMartin preschool case, which turned out to be a woman pretty much made up. And by the time it was very clear they had spent too much money on this to not go to trial, there was this idea of like, these men at daycare centers are going to abuse your sons. These strange single woman teachers are going to abuse your daughters. And now we had Jerry Falwell in the 1990s saying a Teletubby was trying to convert your children. And now what we're seeing in QAnon is kind of the similar stuff we saw with Anita Bryant, they're coming for your kids. And I think the place it was last, I would say the most overt was the 1970s.
I would actually say that it's still pretty overt today. There was a law that they tried to pass.
Oh, no, I agree. I'm just saying that the last time it was this overt was the 70s.
Oh yeah, they were trying to pass a law in Tennessee that said like if a child comes to a teacher and says like I'm questioning my gender, the teacher has to report it to their child's parents.
Yeah. So like this is some background for the 70s. So we had Anita Bryant, we had Harvey Milk, we had a lot of, we had a more visible push for gay rights. Sorry for the tangent. Both Jamie and Todd and I are all, I think, big fans of the podcast QAnon Anonymous and just weird conspiracy theories in general. We're sorry, everyone. We have weird interests outside of our jobs. But that's kind of the background. But in the era of film, we were starting to see a few more depictions of gay people on screen that were a bit more varied and sympathetic. So 1970, we had Boys in the Band, which is an adaptation of a play that was directed by William Friedkin, which, he's going to come up in another decade. John Schlesinger's follow-up to Midnight Cowboy, which is Sunday Bloody Sunday. 1972, my hero, John Waters, he debuts with, well, not debuts, but Pink Flamingos is his biggest hit to date. And while Pink Flamingos, overall, his 70s films tend to be more comedic exploitation, the fact that John Waters is gay himself and he's always just embraced the weirdos, that's made him a queer icon and just very loved by the community. And he's always just been like, yeah, have faith in yourself, have faith in your own bad taste. The Rocky Horror Picture Show comes out in 1975. You can have some discussions about some of the stuff now, but I think for a lot of people of that age, they're like, oh, this is the first thing I've seen that I kind of get. I'm a little weird. I'm kind of gonna latch onto this. Also, hey, great Tim Curry performance. Also 1975, we had Dog Day Afternoon, which if you have not seen Dog Day Afternoon, I will say spoilers. We have the reason Al Pacino's character is trying to rob a bank is because he's trying to pay for his girlfriend's reassignment surgery. And it is portrayed rather than like, oh God, what a weirdo. It is portrayed for the time relatively sympathetically. And 1977, a documentary called The Word Is Out. It is 27 interviews with queer people. They try to get different genders, ages, and races. And outside of the US, we're seeing filmmakers like the incredibly prolific Werner Fassbinder start to make films themselves, like, films with queer content like Fox and Friends. And is it a French-Italian production, La Cage aux Folles?
Yes. We.
Yeah, La Cage aux Folles premieres in 1979, and I believe in the United States, the director was nominated for an Oscar.
I think
If
I don't recall what I know that La Cage aux Folles got some Oscar
Mhm.
nominations. I can't remember which one. It was that or just best foreign film.
Okay. So now in the 80s. So I'm dividing this up into two parts now. It's films by explicitly queer filmmakers and then gayness as it's portrayed in the mainstream. So the 1980s, we have Pedro Almodovar. He makes his debut. If you've never seen any movies by Pedro Almodovar, highly recommend it. We have Rainer Fassbinder's final film, Carell. Don't know if I'd recommend Carell. Carell is, from everything I have heard, very graphic. So if that is not something you want, now you know. 1984, the great documentary, The Times of Harvey Milk, about the politician. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the Gus Van Sant biopic, Milk, as well. What we started to see in the mid 80s is there's the rise not only of AIDS in real life, but we're starting to see it dealt with in film. So Arthur Burson Jr.'s Buddies is the first feature film that dealt with the AIDS crisis. We also had Bill Sherwood's Parting Glances, which I think Bill Sherwood passed away very soon after that movie was made.
Mhm.
1989, we had Stories from the Quilt, Longtime Companion, and that was the first wide released film. So some of these are movies that were more on the independent circuit, but we're starting to see AIDS and the havoc it's wreaking on the community and just how it's affecting their lives, even if it's friendship, dating, how it's starting to, really have its effect. There are some bright spots, though. I think the brightest one would be Donna Deitch's really sweet film, Desert Hearts. It is a lesbian romance that, unlike, something like The Children's Hour, it doesn't end in tragedy. It ends with the possibility of something more. Also has one of my favorite character introductions in any movie is the introduction of Kay driving in reverse to keep up with the car. I think the clip is online, but you definitely feel you get a good sense of that character. Also, I want to. Oh, go on. Sorry.
I also wanted to highlight a bunch of movies from this era by
Oh, sure.
Derek Jarman, who his most famous film is probably his adaptation of The Tempest, which takes place entirely indoors. But all of his movies are absolutely worth seeking out. Blue and Jubilee in particular are some of my favorites.
Yeah, some of those are in the 90s slide.
Okay.
Yeah. I also want to highlight Marlon Riggs, as I'm going to talk about a little later. Majority of the films made by queer people are made by usually by white queer people, usually white gay men. Marlon Riggs was a hugely a Black documentarian and a queer gay man himself, huge groundbreaking director. And his film Tongues Untied, which was made with some arts funding, hailed by activists for being a very unapologetic look at Black gay men and how they live their lives and their feelings and how they deal with both racism and homophobia in society, but also got the ire of senators like Jesse Helms, who argued that the arts should be defunded. Unfortunately, Riggs passed away in 1994, but his work is still hailed, and he's as just pioneering. And the Criterion Collection did just release a box set of a lot of his works, and I think you can find them on the Criterion channel. Some you might even be able to find free and full on YouTube, his shorter documentary subjects. So the 80s. So this is more of the mainstream stuff. So not quite made by queer people. So 1982, we have Victoria with Julie Andrews and Tootsie. Again, one of those for their time hailed as being fairly groundbreaking films, but as with all films, they can be groundbreaking for the time, but sometimes 40 years later, you can go, well, obviously some stuff does not hold up. And I think Tootsie is kind of a good example of that because, one of the tropes of transgender women is, oh, they're men dressing as women to invade female spaces and potentially like take stuff away from them. And though in Tootsie, the main character learns a lesson, the very fact that he's dressing as a woman to get a job is it's a little iffy. I think, yeah, go on.
I will say that I've actually seen all of the movies you have listed here. I really like Kiss of the Spider Woman. I don't know if it's a great movie, but I think it's
Oh, it's a good
morally
movie. Yeah.
I think it's morally complex in a way that a lot of movies are, and I just love The Hunger so much. I've never really liked Tootsie all that much, and I'm going to say that I don't think Personal Best has aged well, not because it's like homophobic, because it's just really boring.
Yeah, it's The Hunger's really good. Actually, B. Ruby Rich wrote a little essay about Desert Hearts, and she said, I hadn't really seen too many films about lesbians before this. The most I figure I could hope for was looking really pretty like the women in The Hunger. um, which, I mean, everyone does look beautiful in The Hunger. Catherine Deveno, Susan Sarandon, David Bowie, everyone's pretty in that movie. The one that sticks out to me is 1982's The World According to Garp. I would consider that to be the first trans woman character. So the character is Roberta Muldoon. The character is played by John Lithgow. Nowadays, John Lithgow probably wouldn't be cast, but John Lithgow and the people, John Irving, who wrote the book, and the people who adapted the movie, none of them saw Roberta as a joke. She's not, she is not someone trying to invade women's spaces. She is a former football player who found out who she was. She found herself, and she's in a community of women that accept her. And she's a very kind, also a very grounded character, which in the world according to Garp, you don't find a lot of. And even when her character passes away, when the newscasters are talking about her, they're like, oh yeah, she lived a good long life. She is 100% treated with respect. And again, it's something you think of the 80s, and there's content from the 80s that just has not aged well. But I look at that and I'm like, well, that certainly has. Also, because I'm a horror fan and I can't do any panel without anything without mentioning horror, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 has kind of become a queer horror movie, or accepted
not
queer
become.
horror movie.
Not become. It is. If you watch that movie, it is ridiculously clear that Freddy possessing that kid is a metaphor for being gay.
I'll have to rewatch it. I am not big on those Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, so I might have to give that a rewatch. But I'm like, well, it's every Halloween and every Pride, horror fans talk about it. So I mentioned William Friedkin before. I don't think we can talk about the 80s in queer cinema without talking about Cruising. So if you are not familiar with Cruising, this is a film. It was released in 1980, directed by William Friedkin. It is about a serial killer who is targeting gay men, and Al Pacino plays a cop who is going undercover to gay bars, specifically leather bars, and it was not well received by the gay community at the time. There were a lot of activists who felt that it was just focusing on the sexual lives of gay people, or sensationalizing the sex lives, i.e. focusing on the leather clubs. Friedkin wanted a very frank depiction of what cruising was, which was looking for a hookup for the night. And he said, he goes, I never intended to really condemn any of this. I just wanted to show a frank depiction. But in an era where good depictions of queer people were still fairly rare, and the opportunity to tell their story was not there as much, it's one where I'm like, I can definitely see why people were not happy about it. And a lot of the calls for the protest came from Arthur Bell. So he wrote for the Village Voice, and he had been covering a number of unsolved murders of gay men. And he was particularly upset by this because in real life, the murders of these men were not really pursued or, by the police. They weren't taken seriously. So he saw the film as completely, in many cases, misrepresenting his work. So again, there are some people. I have met some older gay men who actually, they're like, for all of the background, I like the movie. I was older. It's not completely inaccurate. I was not there. I don't think I was born yet. but it's an interesting case as we're gonna as we especially as we keep going as a who gets to tell our stories. And this was, I think, the first big case of queer people being like, you know, number one, we don't get the same opportunities to tell our stories. Number two, this is the one you're telling out of everything there. I mean, contrast the films that were being talked about in or being made in the 1980s by queer people. They were romantic dramas, they were documentaries, they were explorations of like, just living life in the 1980s versus cruising, which is a far more sensationalized piece. Jamie, any words on cruising?
So again, I want to preface this with I never felt super comfortable in gay male spaces, but I do know that that one of the things you got to understand about queer cinema going from this era and especially before this is that people were so incredibly starved for any kind of scraps that there's this great quote from the Celluloid Closet where this woman say, "You will watch this piece of trash movie because at one point the lead actress puts on a suit, and that is how starved you are for some sort of lesbian representation in your movie." So I do think that while Cruising isn't a great film, I do understand why a lot of gay men from that era would be fond of it.
Mhm. All right, we're moving on to the 90s. So this is where new queer cinema officially happens. This is 1992 when the term gets coined. So from about 1990 to 95 was when there were a lot of queer filmmakers who broke into filmmaking. So some of them, like Greg Araki and Gus Van Sant, they had made their debuts in the 1980s. The 90s was when they got noticed, when a lot of directors started to make the festival circuit. So Todd Haynes, Derek Jarman, as Jamie mentioned, Livingston, Tom Kalin, Greg Araki, they either made their debuts or more accurately their breakthroughs. So Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho kind of becomes a sleeper hit. It stars River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves. And Keanu Reeves, people did ask him, like, "Are you worried this is going to affect your image?" And he's like, "I'm an actor. I'm not a politician."
Whoa.
Well, I think that was more him being like, this is my job. Like, Keanu just proving that he's a great guy. I love him.
He does seem pretty decent.
Greg Araki, The Living End is what gets him a lot of his attention, and then Doom Generation is his first major studio production. I'm hit or miss with Greg Araki. I still think Mysterious Skin is his best work. We have 1994, Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, and we'll also have the more, I would say, Hollywood-friendly To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar. And speaking of the Celluloid Closet that Jamie mentioned, the documentary premieres in 1995.
I do want to make clear, since blue was on this list, it is an 80-minute movie with a single shade of blue on screen that entire time. See it.
I personally am a huge fan of Todd Haynes, so I would say check that out. And I really like Gus Van Sant. Even some of his misses I really like. And now we're going to talk about my personal favorite film from that era. It is Paris is Burning. It is my favorite documentary. It is a film that is both heartbreaking and a joyful celebration of your life and being who you are and finding a space to be who you are. So this was made over the course of, I would like 5 to 6 years, released in 1990 and directed by Jenny Livingston. Jenny Livingston, I think when she started doing the interview work, was still at NYU. And it focused on the ball culture of New York City. So when I talked about this program in advertising, I was saying if you were a fan of Pose, you might be interested in this program. So if you've ever watched that show, this documentary is the foundation of that show. And it features mainly, I think all but one of the people they're queer people of color. Many of them are from impoverished backgrounds, and it's interesting to see the wide variety of people who go to the ball. So you have Pepper LaBeija, who is a house mother. They look after a whole lot of other people, and the houses are where people can find their family because, this was the 1980s. These, in many cases, if you were gay or if you were trans, you would get kicked out of the house and you needed a place to go. And the house could not only provide you with a family, but keep you safe, give you a place to sleep for the night. You wouldn't have to sleep on benches or go into a shelter, or resort to prostitution and potentially lose your life, as it actually happened to one of the interviewees. There's a great line from this documentary. The person who is being interviewed said, you go into the ball, you feel like it's okay to be gay. And you don't necessarily feel that out there, but it's okay in here. And there's also kind of this somewhat of an aspirational culture. There's many categories they have. One of them is executive realness. It's showing that you could be an executive. And as Pepper LaBeija says, it's showing the world, I could be a business executive. I could pull off the look, but you won't let me. Because for a lot of these people, that kind of life is just based on who they are at the time, out of reach. And it's not a film that hides any of the struggles that they have. These are people who've lost families. These are people who have faced violence. They have watched their friends die. Venus Extravaganza, who is she's heavily featured. She's one of the main interview subjects. You find out at the end of the film through Angie Extravaganza that she was murdered. She was a sex worker, and she had talked a little earlier in the film about, she's had encounters with clients who find out that she is trans and having to get out of the hotel room as fast as she can. And it's heartbreaking because earlier Venus is being interviewed and she's talking about what she wants in life. And she's like, I'd like to get married. I'd like to have a house in upstate New York and maybe have kids. And, finding out that she never got any of that is, and again, I keep saying heartbreaking. I just don't know any other way to describe it. But as sad as it is, you also see people for whom the whole world has told them you're nothing, finding a place where they can absolutely be something and find love and find validation. It is such a wonderful documentary. I will say it is not without controversy. People have brought up that while Jenny Livingston is queer, she is a person who is of means. She was white. She came from a family that could afford to send her to NYU. And most of the people that she interviewed were not wealthy and not white. But I think Livingston is someone who was very aware of that when she was making the film. Like, she's never present in it. She's just behind the camera and lets her subjects do the talking. Jamie, any words on Paris is Burning? Because I could talk about this all night.
I don't really have anything to add on to what you said. It's always been one of my favorite documentaries, and I always have to stop it about halfway through and come back to it like a little bit.
Mm-hmm. But it's both heartbreaking and a celebration. But if there's any movie I'd recommend, it would be that. So we're quick tangent, lesbians on film. So talked a little bit about Desert Hearts, but the 90s, we also had like a little mini explosion of lesbians on film. If I can make a 30 Rock joke, lesbians.
The Bound on this list is one of the best movies of the 90s. I just have to say that. I just have to get that out of the way.
Yeah. So yeah, we had Bound, which is romance and noir. We have High Art, which is more of a straight drama about a platonic relationship developing into a romantic one. The Watermelon Women, which is directed by Cheryl Dunye, it explores the intersection of sexuality, race, and cinema. The main character of that movie is researching on this woman who is an extra called the Watermelon Woman, who supposedly had an affair with a woman director in the 30s. It's hinted that it was Dorothy Arzner. Bound is really great. It was the Wachowskis. Was that their first film or just their first major film?
It was their first directorial debut. They wrote a movie, I think, at one point.
Oh, that was the one I was thinking of. Mm-hmm. And we're going on to queerness in the mainstream. So 1991, Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill. Queer people are not happy because once again, it's a, really? we don't have a lot of characters in these, mainstream films getting released to thousands of theaters, and it's a man who kills women and wants to make a suit and potentially be a woman. What? Yeah, not happy about that. It's the movie, and both the film and the book definitely do. They have the whole conversation of Buffalo Bill is not trans. But it's just one where I love Silence of the Lambs. It is one of my favorite films. It's always been a little part that I'm like, doesn't quite sit well with me. Jonathan Demme's follow-up to that was Philadelphia, and widely perceived, and I think probably was a way to atone for something that he didn't even consider. And there was an interview with people who worked on it with Silence of the Lambs, because there were people who were protesting the film, and there were people saying, "Oh, throw the flyers out. We don't need to read that." And he goes, "No, actually, we do."
Mm-hmm.
He looked at that, and I think it's like, I think some people they don't realize how it could be perceived.
Silence of the Lambs is such a fascinating example because in both the movie and the book, they try to soften it a little bit. Like in the movie, it's just Hannibal Lecter saying like, well, he's not really a trans woman. And in the book, it's this lengthy, kind of weird sequence where the FBI director goes to a clinic for trans women. But at no point did either creator think, maybe we should just have the villain be doing something else.
Yeah. I mean, it's still a great movie. It's still one of my favorites. I mean, you can enjoy things and point out like, ooh, some stuff hasn't aged well. And speaking of Demme's follow-up to Philadelphia, I mean, that's groundbreaking in that this was, again, a major mainstream film starring Tom Hanks, who, while he wasn't the star he is now, was a pretty well-liked guy. He had Big in, I don't think it had Sleepless in Seattle at that point, but he had Big and Splash.
He had hit Forrest Gump yet, but yeah, he was still big at that point.
But play a gay man who has AIDS, who is portrayed sympathetically. Some might argue, like, almost to a fault. He's almost kind of in Too Good for This world. But I'm like, you have to remember, 1992, AIDS was still pretty misunderstood and still vilified in some cases. So to see a major mainstream film portray someone who has AIDS, who is also gay, because there were films about people with HIV/AIDS that were portrayed sympathetically, but they were usually like a Ryan White or heterosexual people who had contracted the disease. Again, groundbreaking.
And they still make movies like that.
Yep. Oh, we'll get there.
They'll get there.
Yeah. And then you have Tu Wong Fu, which look, it's a great movie. I love Tu Wong Fu. It's wonderful. In and Out with Kevin Kline, homosexuality and drag is a little more, it's talked about a little more openly. And you have The Birdcage, which is a smash hit remake of La Cage aux Folles. And we were talking about this before the program started, and we're like, there's some stuff that hasn't aged. You're going to find this in any movie ever made. There's some stuff that just doesn't age right. But there is a sincerity to The Birdcage and an earnestness that really, really overall still sells the movie. And I think just seeing an older couple that, considering how much AIDS ravaged the community in older people, or, seeing an older couple where it's like, oh, they made it. It's almost, I can imagine in the mid 90s, therapeutic to see, just like, oh, someone who, they're not dealing with an illness. They're not dealing with death. They're dealing with like, oh no, our son's engaged to a girl whose parents are conservative. What do we do?
I mentioned this to Liz before the program that I was going to bring this up. If you want to know how people look at The Birdcage now, they don't think that's revolutionary. But 2 years before this, the GLAAD Media Award for Best Portrayal in Television went to the episode of Seinfeld where George and Jerry are mistaken for gay, entirely because they add, not that there's anything wrong with it, after every time they bring up being gay. That is where the bar was in the early 90s. Yeah.
I just look at The Birdcage as like, oh my God, my parents went to go see that movie. Like, I just my parents are squares. So man, if they're going. So just want to do a quick comparison here. I am just going to say content warning. These films, one deals with violence against a queer person, the other deals with conversion therapy. So if you don't want to deal with that, you might want to walk away for a minute or two. So two films that one was interesting to see which one is kind of endured as a queer classic, were released in 1999. Boys Don't Cry, But I'm a Cheerleader. So Boys Don't Cry is a dramatization of the case of Brandon Teena, who is a trans man. People he was acquainted with found out that he was trans and he was assaulted and murdered. So this is dramatization of his life. And you have But I'm a Cheerleader, which is very, again, bright, happy colors. And it's a satire of gender roles, it's a satire of homophobia and the conversion camps. And what's interesting is at the time, Boys Don't Cry was the one that received all the acclaim. Hilary Swank won an Oscar. And it would also came out after the Matthew Shepard case. So it was this idea of, we need to talk about the fact that even in the 90s, queer people are, it's not safe. There are still places where they can be murdered for being who they are. But the one that's endured is But I'm a Cheerleader. I would gather because it is probably a less stressful film to watch than Boys Don't Cry.
I mean, we also just have a lot of media that portrays queer people getting killed. I mean, you can get that from before Stonewall too. So I think that movies that are more optimistic are going to be the ones that endure, unless they're really good, like Moonlight.
Yeah, I think Moonlight's kind of optimistic. Kind of.
Moonlight is optimistic but ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. All right, so the 2000s, little push into the closet. Not so much in the year 2000. We had Hedwig and the Angry Inch. And we also, was Mulholland Drive 2000 or 2001?
I feel like Mulholland Drive was 2001.
Okay, I think that might have been pre 9/11, but post 9/11, there definitely was in major films kind of a push for more traditional masculinity. There was also just more of a push for like tough guy films again, or just, tough films, or films where it's like we want a complete escape. And also we saw the rise of the global market, meaning queerness, considering it's not only still a taboo in the United States, but in other countries. We started to see a little decline of it in mainstream films, but we still saw a lot on the independent circuit. Again, Hedwig and the Angry Inch. We started to see towards the mid-aughts, it came back a bit. Brokeback Mountain, high profile film, critically acclaimed. Interesting that, once upon a time, the film about race and racial tension was considered to be the less risky movie to award Best Picture to. Also, Crash is one of the worst Best Picture winners of all time. Brokeback Mountain was stopped.
Crash is considered like a good representation of race by who? I want names.
I don't know. I think no one, but at the time, I think a lot of people in the Academy were like, oh no, if we award Brokeback Mountain, we'll be seen as out of touch. Goes to show you how culture changes. You also had Transamerica, which I think is overall a really good movie. It's about a woman who finds out that, she's on the path to getting her sex reassignment surgery. She finds out that she did help create a child and wants to get to know that child. It's a really nice performance by Felicity Huffman. And you still have the whole like, well, it's a cis actor playing a trans person, but I look at Transamerica as like, well, at least they got the gender right.
We'll get there when we talk about the Jared Leto problem. Yes. I get to rant.
Yes. We also had, again, on the independent end, Jamie Babbitt, who directed But I'm a Cheerleader. She had her follow-up film, and Greg Araki's Mysterious Skin, which, as I said earlier, I think that's his best film. I would say, though, it's a heavy subject. Child abuse is dealt with. So, again, if you do not want to watch that film, I am giving you that warning now. Probably other than Brokeback Mountain being the big queer Oscar winner, we had Gus Van Sant's Harvey Milk biopic, Milk, which I think I watched within the past year. It really does hold up. I am not a Sean Penn fan, but the guy acts the heck out of that. And is a biopic that kind of shows it doesn't completely sanctify Harvey Milk. It shows that he could be a little bullish and stubborn, but it does show, like, I think it follows a lot of the times of Harvey Milk, how he was a very politically savvy person and is like, okay, a good way for us to get rights and support in the community or beyond our community is utilize our economic leverage, start to come out to our friends and family, start to say, like, we're not these abstract monsters that you hear Anita Bryant talking about. We're humans. You know who we are. Yeah, it's a good way to close out this slide as we go to Queerness at the Oscars. So they're nominated, but it's iffy when they win. And a lot of times when they do win, it's stories that are told by cis or straight creators or actors. So again, Kiss of the Spider Woman, Philadelphia, Milk, Jared Leto, we're getting there. Brokeback Mountain, as I said, a little too controversial to win at the time. But fast forward about 10 years later, Moonlight becomes the first queer-themed film to win Best Picture. Yeah, and interesting fact though, a lot, like if you go back in terms of people who worked in Hollywood, George Cukor, he was nominated in 1932. He wasn't out, it was more open secret. But Jerome Robbins was I think he won in the 60s and the first out man to win Best Director. And there were a lot of people who worked behind the scenes, like in costuming and art direction, who had won. It just took a while for queer stories themselves to actually get nominated. And, you know, there's the argument of, oh, should we really look to the Oscars for validation? And I think there's different, you know, I think there's both valid points, but there are a lot of people who look at the Oscars of, oh, it won an Oscar, maybe I'll check that out. So it can be a way to sort of gain like mainstream legitimacy. So, okay, Jamie, this is your time to shine.
So
the Jared Leto problem.
I mentioned that
trans roles.
I was actually mentioning that my X-Files reviews would come up. And the reason why I said that is because in a recent episode of the X-Files spinoff, The Lone Gunman, that I reviewed, there is a subplot about a trans woman, which is actually for 2001 handled pretty well. And it led to a question from a friend of mine. Would you rather have it, like, let's assume for the moment that the option of a trans woman playing a trans woman is out, which it shouldn't be. Like, there's a lot of really excellent trans actors out there, some of whom aren't even really that mainstream yet. You know, there's a really great horror movie from last year called Bit, which is about a trans woman and stars a trans woman in the lead role. Plus, you know, vampires are queer. You heard it here first. But I think that the Jared Leto problem is that whenever you need a trans woman played in a movie, for up until very, very recently, the default is you get a man to play the role. And the problem that comes into that is, even if it's a very empathetic portrayal, and it's not always a very empathetic portrayal, is that the core way that transphobia manifests, even in people who are theoretically sympathetic, is in this belief that trans women are just men in women's clothing, and that isn't that different from being like a gay man who does drag. And that's really not the case. So in answer to the question, if a trans actor has been shut out of the role, would you rather have a cis woman play a trans woman? Yes, because at least you have reached the base level of acknowledging a trans woman is a woman, which is 101, but you know, we're not always there. Also that Jared Leto's kind of an abusive piece of garbage.
Yeah.
In Minecraft, do not sue.
Yeah, I mean, there have, again, I would say John Lithgow is a great example of someone who plays the role very empathetically. And you're like, I can excuse it. I'm like, look, it's 1982. But what's interesting is a few short years post Jared Leto, it is now something that just would not happen. There was a controversy where Scarlett Johansson was on track to play a transgender man, and a lot of people were, I think, just like, really, we're still doing this? And after that, she stepped away from the role, which I'm like, well, she was smarter than when she took the role in Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah. It's And obviously, and it is happening less and less, and that is good.
Yeah, we're unfortunately gonna have to speed up because
Yeah, let's move it along.
you and I talk a lot.
We do.
So 2010, we're kind of getting to the end, but 2010s, we're starting to see a lot of mainstream visibility, both in movies and on television. I don't think we can understate the importance of Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black. Just really putting herself out there and trying to, I think, educate people from, what was it, 2013 on. And I still don't think she's been repaid with great roles yet, but that's a story for another day. But we had The Kids Are All Right, another lesbian narrative that, again, doesn't really end in, it has angst, but doesn't end in like tears and death. We had Love, Simon, which is a teen movie about gay teens, which isn't, again, about crying or I'm being shipped off to a conversion therapy camp. It's just, oh, I have a crush on a boy. And I'm like, again, sometimes you see so much sadness in these movies. You want the happy stuff. Great movie. Two great movies I want to recommend. The first, Celine Sciamma's Tomboy. Celine Sciamma, anything she directs is amazing. But Tangerine is directed by Sean Baker, who directed one of my favorite modern movies, The Florida Project. It's a day in the life of two transgender friends. It stars two transgender women. It is funny. It is frenetic. It has an authenticity that you don't see in a lot of movies. And a fantastic woman starring Daniela Vega. It is a woman, transgender woman, her lover dies, and she has to deal with both, the fallout from the family and how they treat her, and just dealing with losing the person she loved. Daniela Vega gives an amazing performance. Actually won Best Foreign Language Feature that year. It's just an incredibly wonderful movie to watch. Also, I did have to give a shout out to The Handmaiden. If you haven't seen The Handmaiden.
Handmaiden is art, and I would like to drop the recommendation for Bit again.
Okay.
It's real good, and not enough people watched it.
Yeah. Of course, your Carol, starring your Queen Kate Blanchett.
I said it in chat, and I'll say it out loud. A Fantastic Woman. Like, I saw that before I was out, and I cried for like an hour at the end of it.
Aww. And Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which came to the States last year. But if you have not seen Portrait of a Lady on Fire, oh, beautiful movie. A quick little side sort of tangent. So Black queer lives on screen. So I mentioned a little bit earlier when I talked about Marlon Riggs, a majority of films made about queer lives are by and about white queer people. So there were, in the 60s, and then you have Paris is Burning, there were white creators who were like, I'm going to use my platform to highlight queer people of color. And then you had people like Marlon Riggs, Isaac Julian in the 80s and 90s. But since the aughts, there has been, and this pretty much coincides with filmmaking being a lot easier and less expensive to do, a rise in Black queer film creators. You had Dee Rees's Pariah get a lot of attention in the early 2010s, and then you had Moonlight win an Oscar, and you have smaller films like Happy Birthday Martha and The Shakedown, which specifically highlight Black queer women. So it's I just felt like it'd be good to highlight these specifically, also because Pariah is an amazing film. I watched that and I cannot believe that is a debut. That's one where I'm like, wait, she was how old and this was her debut feature? I am wasting my life. So moving on, just another quick comparison before we get to the end of the program. I wanted to look at two films that came out in 2018, Boy Erased and The Miseducation of Cameron Post. So once again, I'm just going to give content warning. This deals with conversion therapy. If that is not something you like to hear about, you can feel free to mute us and come back. So these are two films came out in 2018 that both dealt with conversion therapy. Boy Erased is based on a true story. It is a memoir by Gary Conley. He was sent to a conversion camp by his fundamentalist family in the early aughts, whereas Cameron Post is based on a young adult novel. And that takes place in the early 90s, right around the time of the first Clinton election. She's sent to a camp after a relationship with a classmate is found out. And it's interesting in this because they're both, I think, good films. I like Cameron Post a little bit more. But you can tell Boy Erased had more funding. It has more polish. It had more of an awards push. and it was directed by Joel Edgerton, who, a good actor, but considering Desiree Akhavan, who, she didn't get nearly as much funding to make Cameron Post, and there really wasn't any kind of an awards push. It once again goes into this, like, who gets to tell our stories and why, and, what gets the awards funding. And there is, Boy Erased is definitely a more dramatic story. And there was kind of this idea of, why do we have to sell the more traumatic stories to the Oscars? Why can't Cameron Post, which is more, that ends with the three kids realizing, oh, this is BS. We're just going to escape camp and hitchhike in a truck, and we'll figure ourselves out eventually.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, yep, 2020 and beyond. So this is the close. Kind of sad note, the global box office, I've kind of mentioned it on and off. It's becoming more and more of the focus. So many of our films make a lot of money in China, and China is not very friendly to queer people. And so you are not going to see queer characters in major films anytime soon. The fact that there's a line in Avengers Endgame where a man talks about going on a date with another man, the fact that that didn't get censored was considered practically groundbreaking. It's a statement to, like, unfortunately in mainstream cinema, we're not going to see probably mainstream queer characters for a while. Thankfully, the indie market as of right now is still kind of alive and well. And television, of all places, who would have thought, like, 20 years ago, that TV, where we would be seeing all the great stories? Pose has broken so many barriers in terms of not only having queer actors, but queer content creators, and especially post season, after season 1, like season 2 and 3, telling their own stories. And even stuff like Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, having queer actors play queer characters. On the show Queen Sugar, there's a trans man character who's played by a trans male actor. So that's where we're actually starting to see more of the representation. But there are some nice stories for, like, we're only 2 years into the new decade, so there's not much. But two great examples is Patty Harrison is the lead in the film Together Together. And that is the role of a cis woman who is a surrogate. The director liked this woman's stand up and said, like, you're the person I want for this role. And, Harrison was really like, I don't want it to become too much of a stunt casting thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, in an ideal world where everyone I'll ask you this, Jamie, in an ideal where everyone kind of gets the same opportunities, everyone's on a level playing field for getting an acting role, like, it would just work with anyone would play whomever, right? Or is that what you...
Again, that's one of those things that's like, it's similar to the whole, like, discussion about, is taking a character and race bending a white character into a black character the same as race bending a black character into a white character. In theory, if everything were equal, yes, those would be the same. But, like, is that ever going to practically be the case? No, not in our lifetimes. The fact that we are still at the point where I am completely flabbergasted that kids cartoons, like, there's like 3 kids cartoons that I can think of that have actual gay characters, and the fact that that's all I can think of off the top of my head means that we're not going to be having a level playing field anytime soon. So,
by the way, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power is wonderful.
It is.
Yeah. And the other one I wanted to highlight is Monsoon, starring Henry Golding, or as I like to call him, Mr. Handsome. I have a huge crush on him. He plays a gay man, but that is not the central focus of the story. The central focus is he's going back to Vietnam to kind of reconnect with a world that he left when he was 6 and his parents never talked about, and kind of seeing a movie where the sexuality is almost, it's just a character thing. It's not a central point of the story. It's not the cause of angst. I'm like, wow, wouldn't it be nice if, we kind of go towards this? I mean, who knows if we will.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we have time. Unfortunately, again, you and I can talk up a storm.
Yeah, I do have to go very, very soon, but I'm willing to field a question or two before we go.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? I've seen a couple of thank yous and a few people saying Portrait of a Lady on Fire was beautiful, which, heck yes. Great movie. I cried at the end of that. Oh, Todd corrected us. Lacage was nominated for Best Director, Adapted Screenplay, and Costume Design.
Okay. If you have any questions before we go, so long as they're polite, we'll field them.
Yep. Oh, I see a hand raised. Carol.
Yes, this is a slightly off topic, but one music video that comes to mind that has withstood the test of time is You Make Me Feel Mighty Real by Sylvester.
I love him.
And is there anybody like Sylvester? Was there anything like that?
Musically, I'm very limited when it comes to music, unfortunately.
So queer music, it's one of those things that's sort of become kind of cliche to talk about nowadays, how a big chunk of the disco backlash in the late 70s was built around the fact that it was music enjoyed heavily by queer and non-white people. But as for music videos, as in specifics, it's worth pointing out that up until really very, 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 very recently, music videos were basically experimental short films set to music. You know, you can see a lot of really famous directors getting their start doing experimental things with videos. Michel Gondry is an excellent example. So there are some really interesting queer music videos because they were like, one example, and I'm going to have to swear to say the name of the song, is the song Smack My Bitch Up by The Prodigy, I think it is. Which the whole music video is about this person going out on the town, taking drugs, getting in fights, getting drunk, and bringing a girl home. And at the end of the music video, it's revealed, since it all took place in first person, that the person behind the camera was a woman. And that was incredibly controversial at the time. But it's because music videos are made on small budgets for just whatever weird thing the band or the director wants to do, they can get away with a lot more. They're not really intended to make money the way a movie is.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I was going to say, unfortunately, looks like we might have to go because we're running right up the line, but I would like to thank everyone for coming. And thank you, Jamie, for joining me and being a great co-host. If you ever want to know what Jamie and I talking like in real life is, it's just this.
It's like this, but we go on for much longer.
Oh my gosh, we should do a podcast.
We did do a podcast. You couldn't stay on topic.
You're right. All righty. Well, everyone, thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.
Thank you.
And I
Thank you,
will
everyone,
see
for
y'all
coming
next
out.
month. All right. All right, Jamie, I will see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.